It's time to look into the future. Our next speaker is Christopher Cataldi, a founder and CEO of Genvid Technologies. That is a New York-based startup that creates always-on, massively social games experiences. And this venture ties together Chris's lifelong interests of gaming, service design, and disruptive innovation. And in his talk, he promises to show us the future. So let's give him a very warm round of applause and hope that he will show this.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for that kind introduction. As introduced, my name is Chris Cataldi. I have a company called Genvid Technologies, and we specialize in making awesome online experiences for people watching and interacting with games. I'm from New York. New Yorkers speak very quickly. I apologize in advance if I'm speaking too quickly, but I do want, if at any time during my talk I'm speaking too quickly for you to follow, please do raise your hand and stop me. I empower you to do this. And with that, I'll jump into my talk. Genvid, the company name, comes from two Latin roots, gen, to give birth, vid, viewing. We focus on how people watch games and how people interact with games. And we do it in a very different way than everyone else is doing. So I look forward to kind of showing you that. So my agenda for my talk today, I'm going to talk a little bit about my bias, where I come from and why I see the future and trends as I do. Why now is a good time for us to be having a conversation about the future of gaming. You could argue that every day is a good time for that, but we are in a very interesting time where a confluence of technology, content, and business models are coming together to create some really interesting new potential for the way people interact with games. I'm going to talk about what I call Experience 3.0, and I'll leave that as that for now, and then I'll talk about eSports, and in many ways, many of our customers are looking at eSports as the first step towards something bigger, and I'll talk a little bit more about that there. So first about my bias. As introduced, I'm a New Yorker. I was born there. I lived 11 years in Japan, and I worked for a fleet of companies, starting from Mitsubishi to local government to most recently Square Enix and the Square Enix Group. At Square Enix, I ran strategy and business development for a company called Shinra Technologies. Some of you might know the name Shinra. It was the evil company in Final Fantasy VII. It was a cloud gaming company for Square Enix, so I thank you, Jay, for the rim shot, and you can kind of guess why the naming was there. A lot of my view of where games are and where they're going are influenced by my experience in Japan, so as a caveat, I'm not necessarily sure if what I'm seeing is the future or I just spent too much time in Japan, but I do suggest you listen to me because I have a corgi and therefore I have good taste and I know what I'm talking about. But having said that, I spent a lot of time thinking about cloud gaming, a term that's often used to mean various different things. There was a really interesting talk yesterday from the CTO of a company called Improbable that talks about what cloud can do for gaming, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what we believed at Shinra cloud could do for gaming and what we believe cloud can do today at Genvid leading into the future going tomorrow. Cloud is a really loaded term. It's often overused, unfortunately, to its detriment. We at Shinra were taking games that you could never play locally. So imagine the most overpowered computer imaginable, right? Imagine the biggest map imaginable with the most players imaginable and crazy effects, the oasis, the dream. And the only real way you can implement that in the near future is to have a centrally processed cloud-based system where everyone is sharing that experience. And that's really what we created. And I'll show you a little brief explanation of what we did at Shinra. This is something that we call the Living World demo. This is running off a 64 screens running into one live simulation shared across all 64 rendered windows. And what you're seeing are these dragons that are flying around. And as they're flying around, I'll take you a little forward into this. You can take control of any of the dragons. And this is a huge map. This is 17 times the area of Skyrim. It's populated with 16,000 independent AI dragons that are all moving on their own volition. There's no scripting here. They're all doing their own Fibonacci spirals and kind of following and kind of deciding what they want. It's not the most complex AI, but it is AI that you would never really be able to synchronize using traditional server-client model. Again, an easy way to explain what's going on here is imagine Mario Kart, which has one simulation and multiple cameras into it, but instead of it being your Wii U or your Switch, it's a supercomputer, and instead of 4 screens, it's 64, right? And so you're seeing a huge world with everyone kind of going in there. So I'm going to skip around here, and you'll see we've picked a couple of the dragons, and what they're doing is you'll see on the upper left-hand side, anywhere in the map, we could make real-time new mountains that anywhere. So what we're doing is we're actually changing the height map of an area, dynamically creating that, and that has repercussions to the rest of the world, and everyone else is seeing that. So if you're talking about traditional server-client model, this is gigabytes of real-time data that you would never be able to synchronize across multiple clients, right? This is all happening on the server, and there's no synchronization needed. It's just render it from different targets. We also were able to, on the cloud, dedicate graphics to real-time particle-level water physics simulation. So we hired an associate professor from a university in Japan who had done tsunami simulations, and he took Titan X and put all of its water, pretty much put all of its power towards powering this real-time water. When you watch water in games, it's always simulated. This kind of stuff is usually only used for academic purposes, but we had real-time water. None of this is scripted. This is all water reacting to the world that it's in, right? It's a living world. And as we were playing around with all these AI and a completely changeable map and real-time water at the particle level simulation, we thought, well, what happens if you put those two together? What happens if you take rules that are coming around particle-level water physics and you raise up mountains in the middle of it? You start seeing tsunamis. You start seeing emergent behavior that, again, none of this is scripted. None of this is something that was pre-written. And as we were watching this, we started thinking, wow, this is really cool to play, and it's really cool to watch, and it got us really excited. And it really started making us think of how people interact with games today and how they're going to interact with games tomorrow. So unfortunately, I'm here speaking on behalf of Genvid. Shinra as a company doesn't exist today. But the entire leadership team behind Shinra is now at Genvid thinking of how we can use the power of the cloud to make interactions with games more interesting today. And we start by thinking of how people interact with games today. For the most part, game developers think about their player. Their player is their core customer, right? And their job is to create awesome experiences for their customers, communicate what those experiences are to players or potential players, and keep them playing as much as possible. We live in a world of streaming. We live in a world of people watching people play games and people watching games. So it's no longer just people playing games. So you have players who are viewing, and you have people who aren't necessarily players who are watching because they like a personality or they like a game, the game itself, right? Maybe they're ex-players. Maybe they played the previous title in the franchise and they don't have the time to play it now. And at Shinra and at Genvid now, we are very much cognizant of the fact that how people interact with games is changing, and we create technology that enables developers to create awesome experiences for viewers from the ground up. And I'm going to talk a little bit about why it's important to talk about this now. So we've all heard the term experience economy. Lots of stats around about people wanting to buy experiences as opposed to things. Consumerism is turning into travel. It's turning into viewing things, watching things. You don't amass material wealth, or you're spending more money on visiting somewhere new as opposed to having a nice couch or a nice car. Things that up until now you owned, you now lease time for. Again, cars is a good example of this. And as automation goes forward, we're going to have a lot of time on our hands, right? Time that up until now we were spending on work doing things that are inefficient. AI is going to help us in many ways. It's going to be disruptive in many ways as well. But there are various calculations of this. One point I like to toss out is, everyone thinks of the Industrial Revolution, right? And how the Industrial Revolution changed how we lived and how we worked and how we spent our time. It's thought of that the Industrial Revolution brought up productivity by 0.4%, 8.4%. So when we talk about automation, so from the 1980s, 1990s, cars, the robots that are making in factories and how that replaced labor, that was supposed to bring up productivity by 0.7%. 0.7%. Advanced AI and automation, as we are on the cusp of today, can bring up productivity by 1.7%. 1.7%. So look at the levels of change that we're about to see, right? And we're going to disrupt how people have to spend their time. People are going to have a lot more time to consume content. And the question is, what kind of content they're going to consume. And we kind of already see the trends. This is a graph showing in America the various entertainment sectors. And here you can see the trend line. You can see the absolute amounts. Gaming is by far the biggest and the best in terms of market size entertainment sector here. Movies are stagnating. Music is stagnating. Upticks here and there. They're still substantial, but gaming is huge, right? So it's a really interesting time for us to think about if we're about to have a lot of time and people are going to spend that time interacting with games, how is we, as game developers and people in the ecosystem, going to create those experiences and that are interesting? So there are three main kind of trends I like to think through here. First is gaming and games as an evolution. Second is the web and connectivity as a whole, and spectating. The third is spectating as a general form. Spectating and watching rather than doing, watching other people and gaining some enjoyment from that is how I define it. And I'm going to go through those a little bit historic so we can see what that convergence means, and then we'll talk a little bit about what that can do for us. So games, we all kind of think back to the mainstay of games being the arcade. Truth be told, console games came a little bit before that, and before that there were lots of test projects here and there. But as a business, kind of the first huge wave was really coin-op. And at that time, there were no such things as players or spectators, right? People went to a place that had a game because they didn't have it at home. They saw there was this cool, interactive thing there in a cabinet or in a table-based thing, and they watched people play games, and maybe they got the courage to put a quarter in, and they played themselves, and they found out that they were gamers, right? One thing that other entertainment or media doesn't have is this idea, this bifurcation between consumer and non-consumer, right? Games are very much, I'm a player, I'm not a player. Whether or not that's true, people have that identity. And that wasn't necessarily the case at the beginning of the arcade boom. Today, we don't really have arcades nearly as much as we did at the onset. And while you do have some family amusement centers, in America, you have Dave & Buster's, and you have Chuck E. Cheese's, and you have those, and they're still in existence. One of the few places that arcades are still a huge business is Japan. And I want to kind of get a show of hands here. Anyone here been to Japan? Cool. Okay, any of those people have you been to an arcade in Japan? Fantastic. Okay, if you haven't been to Japan, I highly recommend it. And when you do go, make sure you go to an arcade. Arcades in Japan are prevalent, and they're massive. They're usually multi-story buildings, and they're designed in a very interesting way, where the ground floor is the most casual UFO catcher or something that you don't necessarily need to be a gamer to go and enjoy. You go on a date there, or you go with your kid. You put $1 in, you probably lose your $1, but you try to get something, and it's fun. The second floor, and then there are like 4 or 5 floors here. The second floor is what your kind of your mass media, what people think of when you think of arcades. Your crazy Japanese rhythm games and your dancing games, your fighting games, something that we think of overseas when we think of arcades. Then the third floor is usually something very specialized to Japan. It's going to be a little bit more core. It's these card collecting games where they have RFID in it, and you're putting them on a table that reads it, and you have real-time, mapping of what you're seeing, and you're playing an MMO with cards. It's kind of crazy stuff. Imagine Hearthstone, but with cards, but it's actually WoW, like crazy stuff, right? And above that is you have crazy simulation games. So Japan really is, and this is by design, they've created this hierarchy of levels where people can go and based on how kind of core gamer they are, they can interact with the arcade in a specific way, and the arcade as a business survives because they can go And you can see today, the arcades still exist. Most of that is Japan, by the way. It's still a multi-million-dollar business there. People are going and interacting with games that they're comfortable with in a way that they're comfortable doing and the way they enjoy. After arcades and come consoles, again, consoles, what many of us have today at home, core gamers, et cetera, love it. We bring it home. But the big difference when consoles came, and this graph is actually what I call non-connected console. So this is your NES, this is your PlayStation 1. This is the console without the internet, right? There is only local multiplayer or single-player games. This is where you start seeing the first kind of self-determination of players versus non-players. Players took their games home. The only way, if you weren't a player of a game, that you saw a game was if you had a friend who was a player, right? Arcades kind of went out of style, so it was hard to see these games. And for the longest time, there was this insular player community. And I want to go into how consoles came about next. Anyone know this person? It's a guy named Ralph Baer. He is kind of the forefather of the console. He was an engineer in America in the 1960s, and he was trying to figure out ways for people to generate demand for more TVs. And he went to his company, Sanders Electronics, and he went, I want to work on this thing. Many people have TVs in their home, but we only have 3 channels, and the content there isn't particularly interesting all the time, and we need a reason for people to have TVs. And so he came up with an interesting thing called the brown box. The brown box was kind of the first multi-control home console that pretty much projected images onto a screen at home, as opposed to being in an R&D facility or using stereoscopes, et cetera, oscilloscopes rather. And I'm going to show you a little bit, a 30-second blip of what that was, and I want you to watch this because this is important, how it's done.
Magnavox presents Odyssey, the electronic game of the future. Odyssey easily attaches to any brand TV, black and white or color, to create a closed-circuit electronic playground. Odyssey gives you all the exciting action of hockey and 11 other challenging play and learning games for the entire family. Odyssey, a new dimension for your television, now at your Magnavox dealer. He's listed in the yellow pages.
It's listed in the yellow pages. Almost everything in that ad is now defunct, but what's interesting, including the yellow pages, but what's interesting about that is what has he done? He created Pong, but he called it table tennis, but this is before Atari took it, made it an arcade. This was released in 1972, before Pac-Man or anything those things came out. And you can see it's super simple, right? It's this Pong game, and he put all of these overlays on top of it to make it look like other games. But there was no, contextual connection between the overlay and Pong. All the games were Pong. It was pretty much Pong, and there were a couple of different rules here and there, but pretty much you could go outside the lines. It was, suffice to say, the brown box, while it was a technical achievement and innovative, is not what we think today of games. It didn't have necessarily the minimum specs required to go mainstream, but it did launch people's imaginations. And it was this interactive experience that up until now people saw the TV and broadcast technology as something they consumed. They were stuck with what they had, and one day someone came up and had found a different use for it that was interactive, and it launched the interaction as we see it today. We all are familiar today with network multiplayer. It is the de facto standard with many of the top grossing games. Going back and seeing how we are as a market, when we think of core games, when we think of PC or console, offline is died. It's still, there's some games that are local, but for the most part, we have PC online, right? It's a huge market. So games went online, and the market changed, and we had differences in business model. We went from package sales, so local games are mostly packaged. When I say package, I mean you buy a CD, you buy a cartridge, and from a developer side, you produce a CD, produce a cartridge, you sell it, and your relationship is over. You're not necessarily supporting that anymore because that transaction is done, and you work on the next game. With online, you have the chance to spend forever inside the game, and you also have forever to keep developing, and we have games as a live service, games as whether it's subscription-based or you have events that keep people bring back an engine, games went online. But there's something that's missing from this. You'll notice we're still only in the $70 billion global, and that's when games went online for everyone, and when digital distribution, when smartphone came in, and it's a huge part of the market that everyone here already knows, and again, I'm speaking to the converted here. People who, up until then, were not players, or at least not players when they weren't in front of their PC, are now players, right? Whether it's you're opening up to the casual market, or you're opening up to people who are hardcore gamers but now have access to play a game when they're on the subway or even on their couch because they don't want to spin up their game. It's a huge percent of the market. And again, what you're seeing in almost every area, arcades are at their pinnacle, then consoles come, they eat the arcade. Consoles come, and then connected consoles come, kind of eat their lunch, and you see that going down. Whether or not the play between connected, casual versus PC console, I don't necessarily think that's cannibalism, but we'll see where it goes. But the next step here is live streaming, and this is where we start going into the future. Live streams are how many people consume gaming content today, right? We're all familiar with Twitch and YouTube and Facebook and Mixer and you name it for the non-American dominated ones. Each region has its own huge one that hundreds of millions of people are watching globally. But what we see now is that games, up until now, haven't directly been engaged with the viewing experience. It's usually an influencer or it's a broadcaster that is showing a tournament or whatever it is. It's not necessarily the game developer having a very strong connection authoring what's going on, but that's going to change going forward. Live streaming, where we are today, is probably going to be as influential as network multiplayer was for the last 15 years. Web, I'll go very quickly through this. The post office is dead other than for places like Amazon and large logistics retailers. It was replaced by email. No one wants to really pay for stamps, right? We went from that to people went online for information. Then people started making information themselves. We still pretty much live in this age. And the question is, again, this is something of my own accord, when people are no longer making websites and no longer just posting Instagram photos of what cheeseburger they ate that morning, but actually streaming their produced content of live video, things change very quickly. And we have all kinds of interesting potential for how people can interact with each other and through games out of engine, and I'll come back in a second. World is going towards streaming. People consume streaming. People produce streaming. This is the wonderful example of Netflix eating the world. Netflix went from package. Again, in America, Netflix was the blockbuster killer because you didn't have to return your DVD to the store. You could just put it in a mailbox. That's what Netflix meant. You could order online and ship it back, right? They started streaming as a way to get their user base not to be angry because they always had a backlog of the DVD you wanted not being available, and then that became much more popular, and this green here is American users, and then they're going international, right? Everyone is going to watch Netflix soon. This is still consuming content, right? Look how big it is. It's still consuming content. What's coming next step is what's really cool. And from a cloud gaming perspective, I want everyone here to be really excited. Latency is the thing that defines interest in our industry, right? We want to be the lowest latency possible. Many places in the world are still behind the trend in terms of end user connectivity. 5G is going to change that in many ways. I'll talk a little bit of what that means. How many of you are cognizant of 5G? Okay, how many of you know what that means? Yeah, good. There's some people here. Low latency streaming, which is both on the server side and 5G as a method of transfer, but also cheap server-side rendering. Render is getting cheaper. How we produce the images we see, it's getting much, much cheaper. It's getting very, very cool. So download speed is going to be just completely different compared to 3G and 4G, right? These are, we made this slide. Tell me if you think it's cool. If you want to download a 4K movie, full 4K movie, 160 gigs. If it's 3G, it would take you a week. You could watch all of Star Trek DS9, all of Star Trek, the original series, in the time it would take you to download that one 130-minute, 90-minute movie. 4G, you could watch 4 hours. You could watch all of Gone in the Wind in that time. With 5G, you can download it in 2 minutes, right? In what time it takes you to do a commercial break. This is the kind of stuff we're talking about here. And what about latency? Because that's the main thing. It doesn't matter if it's fast if the round trip is not fast enough. 3G, forget 3G. We don't think about that as a latency. It wasn't really made for data only. It was data and voice. 4G was really made for data. And again, that's how most of us use it. Very few of us use our phones as phones anymore. 5G, again, this is theoretical, so call it for what it is. Assume it's 5 times as bad as that. So 5 seconds, 10 milliseconds. We're talking very, very different types of response times here. And that changes the kinds of interactions we can have in-game and also out-of-game. And this is where spectating gets important. So spectating is not new. Spectating is possibly the oldest action there is. When there is someone doing something, there is another person watching them do it, right? And they're players and they're watchers. We all know the best example of this, the Coliseum. You have the professionals in the ring, but who are the people who decide the outcome? It's the people sitting in the stands, right? And then you go there for that experience. This exists today, right? I mean, sports, to an extent. We go to a sports stadium for that reason. There are lots of technology that come to this space. You've probably never heard of this, but this is a place called Banner. This is a kind of a experiment called Banner Battle that was around in the late 2000 single digits, where fans in the stadium could cheer for their team, and you'd have in readout kind of a tug of war. There are 2 teams here and here, and you could see who's winning in the audience. No effect on the players, obviously, because the players are playing their game, but it got them to cheer, and the idea is you have engagement, and cheering theoretically could affect how the players play, et cetera. Reality TV is, again, something that is dominated the last, I think, 15 years of at least television. People are watching, people get invested in the personalities they like, but they also take a direct, interaction. They are voting for their winners, right? They're supporting these people, and there's no better way to get people to watch your show than to get them invested in making sure that's their favorite, contestant is going to win. They're definitely going to show up to watch every week, and they're definitely going to call in, and it's this wonderful virtual cycle. So the question is, what happens when streaming comes about, and you have super low latency, super high bandwidth, low cost render? How does that affect games? Well, we're seeing, obviously, everyone here knows Twitch plays Pokemon. This was a game that was not designed to be streamed. It was not designed for multiple inputs. It still had over 1 million players in a couple days. It is the Guinness Book World Record holder for the most people playing a single-player game. Great. The question is, what happens when games are built from the ground up for this world? And so that's what I call Experience 3.0. And I'll talk what is Experience 3.0 and why 3.0. So if Experience 1.0 is your local game, it's your local arcade, where you're playing alone or you're playing with a person, and you have this self-selection of people playing, gamers, non-gamers. Experience 2.0 is the same game but networked, and you can make all kinds of cool examples of games here. This is most online multiplayer games. If you're playing Minecraft or whatever it is, if all of us here were in a match, we're all playing the same game on roughly the same sort of hardware, roughly the same sort of UI. Obviously, you have cross-platform play. You might have a mobile client, but for the most part, the game has been designed so that we're all interacting the same way, regardless of what we're doing. We're all enjoying it the same way. Then Experience 3.0 is this idea of different ways of interacting with games, different kinds of game content depending on preference, player preference, and brand new experiences based on the technology that's there. So again, this is meant to show that you might have some crazy guy in a VR helmet, in a headset, in a Tesla suit, who's going crazy and getting real force feedback. On one side, in a arcade in Dubai, or in his house, because he's made that investment, he might be co-playing with someone on their phone in New York who isn't playing the same game, but the game that they're playing is interacting with that world that the VR person is in. And why is it going to be interesting? There are a whole bunch of factors that go into this. First, games are constantly going, games are available everywhere, and people are starting to see that different people like different ways of interacting with games. And lots of people are online, and when you put these all together, cool things are possible. And lots of people are watching games. Lots of people, in many cases, more people who self-identify as core gamers are spending more time out of engine watching people play video games than they are playing the game themselves. This is metrics. These are viewers. And this is actually very, very low estimate of how many people are watching people play video games. These are eSports numbers, but think of people watching people play video games as hundreds of millions of people. It says 200 million people today. We don't really know the actual number in China. It's probably much higher there. So eSports is the first step. And before I get into more about why eSports is the first step, I'm going to show you really briefly my tech and why it's cool, and you'll understand what I'm kind of talking about here. So I'm doing something which you should never do, and I tell you as much as possible if you can, if you want to be an entrepreneur, do not show live demos of your technology when you can't control the network and you can't control anything. But I'm going to do it because why not? This is a live stream of a match of Unreal Tournament. You guys all know Unreal Tournament. And I've been talking all about how people are watching games and they're going to interact with games differently. I'm going to talk a little bit and show you a little bit about how that's going to change today. So I'll refresh it so you can see what's going on. You'll refresh the page. This is just a regular page, nothing crazy. We're watching on YouTube. This is a live match of Unreal Tournament. And in this case, we're watching some crazy guy play, and he's not particularly interesting. So let's wait for him to die, hopefully. In fact, I can do something really crazy, and yeah, so I don't really like Riker, so let's kill him, but no, I guess not. So you've never clicked on a live stream of a match before, a game before, because why would you? What you're going to see going forward is I click on a player. Each viewer can click on a player and find everything about that player, right? You've never seen that before. This is coming, right? So again, I click on a player. I find everything about that player. I find what loadout he has. Haven't you watched the match and you want to know more about it? This is coming. I can cheer for a player, so that's Lieb. So I'm going to press a thumbs up. When I press a thumbs up, you get a flame above his head, right? It's flame that's being shown only to you, but in this case, that is actually inputting into a popularity index. And so now the game broadcaster knows that people like Lieb. So we're going to start probably seeing more of Lieb, right? You'll see as Lieb, and now we're watching Lieb. You'll see as it's running around, there are ads in the background. You'll see Mountain Dew and Pepsi. Those are actually not in the video. These are overlaid onto it as well. It's a really interesting world. Say we don't like Lieb. Well, if the developer still wanted to do it, we could kill Lieb. So viewer pressed a skull button, and now we've got a live death countdown. Lieb, unfortunately, is going to die in 13 seconds, and we'll watch until he dies. Lieb's going to be very angry in about 2 seconds. Oops. Okay? This is the future. This is viewers taking an active engagement into their game. Say you didn't want to watch this. Okay, let's watch a different viewing angle. We can do that as well. We can do whatever you want. This is what's happening here is I have a live spectator on the cloud that's connecting to the live multiplayer game and rendering anything in that game. And it's also sending a separate metadata stream that's being synchronized. Again, that Pepsi ad is not there. Players don't see it, right? It's customized to each viewer. This is the future, or at least this is the first step towards the future of games, is viewers taking an actual kind of ownership or interaction with the games they're watching. So why broadcast? Up until now, broadcasts were really run by the streamer, really run by the influencer, right? Game developers, there was no way for them to add value beyond making the game. They sold the game to the influencer. The influencer had their following. Their following liked that game, and maybe they bought it, right? There was a marketing thing to it. The experience going forward is viewers are not necessarily always going to want to become players. Right now, there's a choice. It's a bifurcation, right? You're either a player or not a player, right? Going forward, viewers, as they're viewing, can have these interactive experiences based on interactive overlays. And again, there's a reason I showed you the Magnavox Odyssey in the beginning, because literally it was a broadcast technology with an overlay that was interesting, and that started our entire video game sector. What happens when you have real-time interactions from viewers? So everyone is going to become a participant, right? There is no bifurcation between player and viewer. You can engage however you want. You can go in-engine and have the best spectator experience and the best playing experience, or you can be on your phone. and it won't run, the game you want to play, but you can watch it, interact with it. If you have a player that you like, you can send him, real-time cheers, or if the game allows for it, you can buy him stuff, or you can buy stuff for yourself. It's all going to happen. This is going to substantially expand the revenue base. Right now, we're really only looking at players, right? Interactive viewers are an opportunity, and spectators who up until now, right now, if you look at the people who are watching these games, they're usually players of the game they're watching, or they're ex-players of the game they're watching. It's a kind of a hard thing to watch a game you've never played before. With these new tools, you'll be able to watch it. And people like watching games. Maybe they like watching games they never play, right? Not too many people play Pong anymore, but if you put Pong on the side of a building and you make it a spectator experience, people will gather around and watch it. Today, we still broadcast games in first-person mode, right? We show the view of the player and only the player because that's the audience. But if we want to expand it, it's going to be third-person view. It's going to be non-player view. In addition to player view, because you're going to have both audiences, people who want to watch from the player perspective, but also from the non-player perspective. And I can show you, I'm running out of time and I want to take questions. So I have a really cool VR demo where I can show you stuff as well, but I'm going to skip through it for now. And if I have time after Q&A, I'll show it. Esports is the first step towards this. It's growing. Yay, huzzah. I think it's fantastic. When we raised our seed round, we kind of positioned ourselves as an eSports tool so that investors would understand what we're doing, although where we know the world is going is these cloud gaming, these crazy experiences, but eSports is the first step. $890 million today, fantastic. But by what metric is that fantastic? If you were to look at that compared to traditional sports, it's tiny, right? Nothing compared to the NFL or Major League Baseball or even the NBA. But why are we talking small fish here? Why are we looking at where we sit compared to sports and kind of shackle ourselves to outdated broadcast technology when we as game developers in the game industry have access to the entire games? I'd rather increase the game market by 5-10% than care about where we are vis-a-vis sports, right? And it takes a different kind of mindset. We need to think about how people spectate games, what kind of content that spectating is. Fighting games aren't necessarily like MMA, right? We're not watching for the same reasons. What are the real-world sports that have corollaries there? And you can watch the stream of this, and I won't go through it, but fighting games are fast-paced, tactics-focused, not necessarily as visceral. MOBAs, I see them as medium-paced, more team tactics-focused. Strategy games are very similar to places like poker and very much stats and tactics-based. And MMOs are more about the narration, more about what's going on. Think of if you've fallen asleep watching a golf broadcast, that's how people who watch like non-PvP MMO streams feel, who don't know the game. Think about it, right? We've identified 3 different tiers of interaction for people watching games, and I'll go through them very quickly. Informational, customizable, and influential. Informational was what I just showed you, right? It's finding out information about the game. So in the demo, it's clicking on the player, finding out everything about the player, finding what his loadout is, what ranking he is, his rating, and being able to really understand that. Customization or customizability is each kind of viewer demographic having their own customized experience. And what does that mean? Well, we have many different kinds of people who are in the world. Some people are new to the game. Some people love the game and are experts at the game. They shouldn't necessarily share the same viewing experience, right? They should enjoy it in a way that's native to them. We also have regional differentiation, right? If you watch it in Korea, you watch it in New York, you watch it in St. Petersburg, the exact same match, maybe you want to watch it in your native language in a way that's kind of contextually relevant for you. Maybe you want to watch the right player. You want to watch player here, player there. There are all these different ways of doing it. Again, the ads is a really kind of evil way of showing it, but if it's part of an overlay and we have sponsors that have adult beverages and they don't want to be seen as a moral hazard, it makes a big difference if I can show it to an adult as opposed to just putting it there, right? And that brings in non-endemics as well. And this is important from a business sense. And then there's influence. And influence is kind of like the holy grail, but it's also the hardest to do. And it's affecting the game live. And within that, there are 2 kind of sub points. One is passive, and that's cheering. That's something that can affect the broadcast, right? who you're focusing on, or what are you replaying, or who's the MVP, that kind of stuff. And then above that is active input, and that's actually changing the game balance, right? Things that up until now were RNG or completely scripted, tomorrow are viewers replacing that through some way, shape, or form. Again, we have examples of that in the demo. You cheer for a player, you go to the player's camera, right? You influence the game by killing the player, right? My job and what we're doing at Genvid is to create the tools for developers to solve these problems, to see the broadcast as not something that's outside of their ecosystem, but very much a part of their ecosystem. And making what Ralph Baer did in 1972, taking something that was completely consuming only one-way passive interaction, creating something that, can fundamentally change how we interact with games. Things that up until now have been promised to us, like gamification, cloud gaming, VR, you name it, massive multiplayer, awesome online worlds, are only going to be possible if we can find the business models to support them, and one of them is going to be us being able to engage people who don't necessarily want to go whole hog and be the early developers. So with that, I thank you for your attention, and I'll take questions.
Right, we have some time for some questions. And the first one.
No questions? I did an amazing
Come
job.
on.
You guys?
At least
over
one.
there? Okay.
Hello.
Hi, Gavin.
What is your best guess on the size, percentage-wise, of spectators actively engaging? Because spectating is often watching television or watching any media is often a very passive, relaxing state. What chunk do you think is going to reach out and grab the controller?
It really does depend on how you design the game, right? I mean, if you look at people who would today, if you made it, it's as low as 5 to 10%. I think it could be much, much higher depending on how you create the game. At the end of the day, it's how big is your market for a game, right? And even if it's as low as 1 or 2% of any major game, that's substantial revenue that we can see there. And yeah, I hope that's answering your question.
And offline, we talked about a non-game use case. Can you talk about a little?
Non-game, so for example, sports is something we could do fairly easily here. I mean, there are plethora ways you could use this. We could start using games as a true gamification. So instead of just having badges and achievements and getting points because you walked, you could start influencing behavior and using that as real in-game currency in another game you're playing or another way you're influencing a stream. For sports, for example, what we do at Genvid is we very easily take out information that's trapped in the game, trapped in the game engine, right? When you're rendering a frame, you know everything about the game. That's how games are rendered. You're rendering each object. So if you export player positional data or player capsule data, you can make it interactive, right? If we know, for example, in sports, where the players are in the field, and you put that in Unity, you put that in UE4, I could do the exact same thing that they do there. It's just a matter of collecting that real-time sensor data. Thank you for your question.
Thanks a lot for your inspiring presentation. I wanted to ask about esports and live streaming that can potentially ruin esport. Mm-hmm. Because, as you know, already there has been some cases of esport cheating.
Sure.
Due to live streaming. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so ghosting is a big issue. There are all kinds of issues here. To your point, it's still a problem that has not been solved. I think that developers who are more proactive are solving that, whether it's through delay, whether it's through only showing some information. It really does depend on the game and how. But at the end of the day, the only way it gets solved is if the developer takes a direct ownership of the broadcast and makes design choices. Do we need any kind of real-time feedback to it? Is only really important for non-competitive games, right? So cheering, any kind of ghosting that's distributed, any kind of game stream that's distributed is going to always have that problem of ghosting because there's no way for you to block someone who might be watching and playing at the same time. Betting and rigging is something that's going to solve itself once esports is big enough that players have something to risk. Right now, it's still very early in how much they're getting paid, so we have that issue now, but I think that'll solve itself. Thank you. Okay, I think I'm at time, so if there are any questions, I'm here. afterwards, and I'm happy to take your questions. Again, thank you very much for your time, and I hope you find it enjoyable.